good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to another week of the Global Café. My name is Elizabeth Lewis, and I'm a Senior Policy and Project Coordinator here at the IFA. Before I introduce today's guests, we will be launching a brief survey for you to respond to regarding the Global Café topics and your experience with the Global Café. So if you have a moment, just please take a second to just answer the survey that we're launching now. But back to today, I'm very excited to be introducing you all to Dr. Sarah Mayer. Sarah Mayer holds a MPhil in Developmental Studies from the University of Oxford and a PhD in International Health from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. She has conducted research on predictors of intimate partner violence and measurements of IPV, including amongst older women and women with disabilities. Her research has focused on refugees and migrant populations, and she has led and collaborated on research in South Sudan, Uganda, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Kazakhstan, India, Thailand, and Cambodia. Most recently, she was a senior research fellow at the Institute for Medical Information Processing, Biometry, and Epidemiology at Ludwig Maximilian University, where she focused on longitudinal analysis of violence against women in Kazakhstan and systematic reviews of theories and predictors of IPV. Her role as a scientist in the Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research at the World Health Organization, she leads the department's research portfolio on violence against women, including implementation of research on health systems' response to violence against women and measurements of quality of health services in humanitarian settings. So as you can see, Dr. Sarah Mayer has done so much in her career, and we are very fortunate to have her join us here today. So thank you very much. And before we get to talking about the dynamics of violence against older women, I wanted to ask a little bit more about yourself. So as we've learned from your biography, you currently lead research at the WHO for violence against women. What ignited your passion in this field, and how did you get started?
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and really happy to be here today and to join everyone on this discussion. So which is held during the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So the timing could not be better. And so how did I get started? So I had undergraduate and graduate training in social sciences, and then started to get interested really in public health and the tools that you can use in public health to understand social dynamics, social problems, and then also understand how and where interventions can address those issues. I started off with some studies on mental health and was really focusing on that in some work on the Thailand-Burma border and in Uganda, and then through that transition more to working on violence against women and children. So I worked in Uganda on the first National Violence Against Children survey, and then started working with the department I'm currently with at the World Health Organization. And I would say, like, it is a field that is still relatively new in terms of some of the public health approaches and interventions and the way in which we're building the evidence base. And so it still feels like an area where research and evidence can make a big difference in terms of how we're responding to and the interventions and services that we're providing to women.
Thank you so much for laying out that context for us. And although our audience members are likely familiar in one way or another with gender-based violence, could you help set the stage for us all by explaining the definition of gender-based violence and show how it is, defined or understood differently, specifically for older women and older adults?
Sure. So gender-based violence very broadly is defined as any harmful act perpetrated against a person based on socially ascribed gender differences between males and females. So that act can be against a male or a female, but the vast majority of gender-based violence is perpetrated against women, and it can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic coercion, other threats, other aspects that are considered forms of gender-based violence are forced early marriage, female genital mutilation. So those are all areas that other colleagues of mine work on at the WHO. In terms of, how is it defined or understood differently for older adults? The definition stays the same, but what we see when it comes to older women is that we'll talk a little bit in a little bit about the lack of data, but that compared to women of reproductive age, and generally that's defined as women between 15 to 49. The work that we've done, we've defined older women sometimes as above 50, sometimes as above 60, but generally that they may be experiencing different types of relationship dynamics and different types of violence than older women would be than with the younger women and women at reproductive age. So for older women, what we've found through different research that we've done, I led a systematic review of qualitative literature and really looked at that recent exposure to violence is really interlinked with violence victimization throughout the life course. So taking a life course perspective, we have to see that gender-based violence against older women is not, it often doesn't emerge only later in life. It's often a continuation of other aspects, but it can be exacerbated. It can be triggered by stressful events, which might be children leaving home, the dynamics of aging with a partner, illness, aspects like that, and also aging and vulnerability. Aging and some of the vulnerabilities that can bring can change and shift the ways in which women are able to cope with violence in terms of physical response and also emotional capacity. So what we see is some similar patterns where one of the most prevalent forms is intimate partner violence, but also instances of family members as perpetrated, where we had studies that captured instances of physical and verbal aggression by mentally ill adult children, violence enacted by an elderly partner with dementia against older women who were caregivers, and different forms of neglect, financial exploitation, and emotional abuse by caregivers. So what we see is we have this general definition of gender-based violence. There are some dynamics that are different or exacerbated for older women. The definition stays the same, and we often also do see that it's a continuation of violence that was experienced earlier in life.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you for highlighting that and showing what the difference is and how there's also a lot of similarity. When we are researching violence against older women, how do we know that an act is done on the basis of someone's gender rather than their age or an alternative demographic consideration?
I mean, that would, I suppose, require some insight into, and there is research on into perpetration and
Right.
what are the reasons for perpetration. What we do know is that the patterns of violence that are seen globally do reflect power dynamics between men and women and sort of the embedded patriarchal norms. So when we see that violence is more likely to be severe between when perpetrated by a man to a woman, when it's more likely to lead to injuries. So those are the aspects that lead us towards having a gender lens to this. But what I would also say is that it's not either or. I mean, one of the challenges in this research and literature is that there are different frameworks for understanding it. So one of the main frameworks for understanding violence against older people has been that it's a form of mistreatment, it's elder abuse. The main focus is on the age as the primary factor influencing vulnerability. When we have that lens, then when there's not sex disaggregated data, then we really leave aside that there could be power dynamics depending who the perpetrator is, depending on the age and strength of the perpetrator. We also have, a different, another framework which is often looked at for violence against older women focuses on the context of the caregiving and institutional arrangements. It looks to protect older adults where that's needed, and again is often looked at, kind of a gender neutral way. But we do need to understand within institutions, within caregiving environments, within the home, are older women more vulnerable to certain forms of violence than older men, and when? But it's not either or, and there's certainly intersection with other forms of other demographics as well.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. And I guess in a similar vein of the previous question, how does violence against women look differently at a global scale across, the basis of one's race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, or culture? Do we have knowledge on how that looks differently for older adults?
For older adults, not very much. Globally, we have, and I'd encourage people to look at the most recent estimates that the World Health Organization put out, which was they were released in 2021, I believe, but they cover data up until 2018. And those show across countries, regions, and globally estimates of intimate partner violence and physical and sexual intimate partner violence and non-partner sexual violence. So based on that, you can see in the past year or over the course of a lifetime, what is the prevalence? And we do see huge overlap with socioeconomic status. If we want to say very broadly, that low and middle income countries, in particular Africa, particularly Oceania and some of the smaller island states there, those have very, very high past year prevalence, 60, 70, 80% of women reporting exposure to violence in the past year, and that those numbers are much, much lower in Western Europe, Australia, US. So broadly, you can say that socioeconomic status is an important predictor and an important aspect that leads to this variation. In terms of race and ethnicity, there's not really good global data. The same with sexual orientation. And culture, I think people are a little bit careful to make strong statements about, how does violence against women vary depending on culture, because that's so we can't really, say that there's the same culture across one country or one region. But what we can say is that violence happens everywhere. And so if anything, there's a culture of normalizing violence, of accepting violence against women that really needs to change. And the places in which it's, in which violence is much higher, you do see that driven by social and gender norms, which are important to take into account.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And we have an audience member question that is similar to what you mentioned on socioeconomic status, but I want to make sure we're covering it as well. So Shmuel's asking, what according to you is the connection between violence against older women and poverty and social inequality? Any additional points to make there?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that question. That's really helpful, because what we do, we see a couple of things, and particularly in the qualitative literature. So we saw things like that ongoing and sometimes increasing economic coercion and forms of financial violence. Really, there's not an incredibly good definition or way of measuring this, but that there were forms of economic and financial restrictions that are put on older women. It can be in terms of their access to bank accounts, their management of their finances. There are cases in which, potentially due to cognitive decline, but potentially also there's, a gray area where is this a form of control? There can be family members taking over control of resources. So there is an intersection where, firstly, there are forms of violence that can result in more poverty. And there's this, and social inequality gets kind of reinforced in that way. And also that is highlighted and emphasized more for older women, because if that's over the life course, then that's been a lifetime of potentially being restricted to work or to get new skills, to access levels of education that they want. And so there's kind of an impoverishment throughout the life course. So there is that connection, and also that connection is linked to lack of options to potentially leave an abusive relationship or an abusive situation, access services when needed. We saw in a couple of studies, isolation, like living in very rural, isolated areas and not knowing of or having access to services could be a factor in not leaving an abusive relationship or situation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for highlighting those discrepancies there and differences for economic status and how that impacts violence as well. Being cautious not to perpetuate a victim blaming sort of narrative, are there any risk factors associated with intimate partner violence or gender-based violence against women?
Yeah, no, I think that there are many, and we don't, and because many of them are actually to do with the perpetrator, we don't have to
You're
worry
right.
about
Okay.
victim blaming. A very strong predictor of male perpetration of violence is their own exposure to an experience of childhood adversity and either witnessing or experiencing violence in the household. So one of the most, and I see when in the chat, one of the questions about effective ways to prevent
Yeah.
IPV, one is to reduce girls and boys exposure to violence in the home. There's different theories that also say that both boys and girls, when exposed to violence in the home, take from that a social learning theory, take from that's the right way to deal with a difficult situation, that's normal, that's acceptable, and so women will accept it in a relationship and men will perpetrate it. This is
Right.
not something we don't want to say that this is a 100% predictor. Most of the time, there's widespread violence in homes. Most of the time, those people do not go on to perpetrate, but it is a very strong predictor. That is also combined with alcohol use. Men who use and abuse alcohol and drugs are very strong. That's a very, very strong correlation with men's perpetration of violence. And the third main area I want to look at is ascribing to patriarchal social and gender norms, essentially. So men who in their household growing up or in their peer group have particular social and gender norms reinforced about the role of women within a relationship, that they have to agree to certain things, that women have to, take on certain roles in the household, that they can't refuse sex, things like that, that those are strongly correlated also with perpetration of male violence. There are also risk factors for women, like I said, that they've experienced violence can also be a predictor of violence in adulthood, levels of education, socioeconomic status. So there is a huge range of risk factors. They vary by place, and it's important to take into account many of them. But I would say when you're looking at the level of the perpetrator, you're looking at their own experience of violence, you're looking at alcohol and drug use, and at like their views and their level of agreement with different social and gender norms.
Okay. No, thank you. That's very interesting. And I guess I'm also wondering, is there any data or any knowledge that you have in terms of the impact of social or political climate of a country, if there's a more conservative government, if there's a more, right-leaning traditional conservative political environment? Do we have any data in that correlation between a rise in violence against women?
Yeah, I have to think. I think there likely are. There have been some studies that have tried to look at things like on a macro level and
Right.
compare some of the country level correlates. Still in those studies, they showed more that community-wide social norms and gender norms were very highly predictive. GDP level is also, like at a national level, highly predictive. But what I would say is, I think we're starting to see in this era, because potentially this research could be done more now, where we see governments globally coming into power, that have more set social and gender norms,
Yeah.
and we might be able to look at those correlations. It's difficult to do from a data perspective and from a methodological perspective to really strongly be able to also control for all the other variables. But
Right.
certainly when we think of risk factors, we think of them as operating at multiple different levels. And certainly the macro level, the societal level would be one that heavily impacts. There's been some interesting, this is a sort of a bit of a tangent, but there have been some studies, mainly economists, who've looked at things like, does a change in the law allowing divorce or the reasons why you can divorce, does that lead to a reduction in intimate partner violence? So some of those larger kind of policy levers, and many of them, not all, but many of them do find changes that happen when you have like a big sort of overarching change in a law and violence against women.
Right. And this feels similar to the question that we have Dominic asking in the chat here. He's asking, in Canada, there are efforts to declare an epidemic of violence against women. Do you believe this can make a difference?
So declare, yeah, I mean, I think that government willingness to call out what is happening, to call it what it is, an epidemic, certainly, and to, but not just to say that, but then to resource that. So if you're saying that, but then you're not acting on that in terms of giving the funding needed for the research. I mean, Canada has been really quite good in terms of generating data and surveys and evidence. So I think in that sense, Canada has certainly, you know, put their money where their mouth is and generated the data and evidence. Behind that, you also need using translating that data and evidence and that understanding to concrete policies, interventions, programs. So I think that recognition of the scope and of violence against women, whether all women or older women, can make a big difference, but that has to be resourced and that has to be then implemented.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. So as we've discussed, one challenge with conceptualizing violence against women is the lack of data and research on older women in particular. Could you speak a bit more to what the challenges and gaps in data collection are and what would be needed to be researched to increase our understanding of violence that's occurring for older women?
Sure. So what we do have more, I mean, we have quite a lot more data than we have previously had. And part of that is because the sustainable development goals that are focused on violence against women both have in them, one of them is focused on intimate partner violence and one of them is focused on non-partner sexual violence. Both of them have within them the age range. The indicator is, you know, we want to understand how many women 15 and above. And it used to be that the data was 15 to 49, but now countries need to report on women age 15 and above. So that has spurred interest and the need for many countries to collect data through demographic and health surveys, through national surveys, through dedicated surveys on violence against women across the life course. So there is an increase, there is better data. So just to cite, you know, an example from our estimates of the 161 countries that have at least one population-based survey that includes, is either totally focused on or includes violence against women, 104 of those measured some prevalence of intimate partner violence against women age 50 and older. Most of that, though, I think about 30 or 40 of those countries is from, actually probably more, but 30 or 40 of those are from one particular European survey, which does the same methodology across many, many European countries. So a lot of that is from high income settings. And the limitations to that are that there are only one country, Mexico, has any questions in there that are specific to older women. So if we want to understand, are there particular forms of violence that are more likely to be experienced? I mean, we need to be including those questions, and that's literally one survey, one country that's doing that. The other challenge is that many of those countries are including women older than 50, but not reporting age disaggregated data for that age group. So they might say 50 plus, and that's it. But we have for all the other age groups disaggregated by 20 to 24, 25 to 29, but then all the other women are lumped into one group. So we don't have adequate age disaggregation for that age group. So even when they are included, there's not enough. And there's still not enough overall. Only about 10% of the eligible data points on prevalence of violence, of intimate partner violence against women, were for women aged 50 and older for our estimates. So only about 10% of the data is representing globally all women aged 50 and above. So that's a huge problem and means that we just can't do enough. We don't have as much of an understanding or as strong of an understanding as we really need to be able to provide the services, the policies, and the programs that this age group is needing.
Thank you. And what do you think contributes to this lack of data or this large gap for the older cohort? Do you think it's, a lack of interest or lack of accessibility to this population, or what do you think is sort of causing this large amount of missing data?
A lot of focus on understanding the impact of violence against women is on understanding the impact on their children. And so women of reproductive age are often asked a lot of questions, and a lot of in these surveys, and a lot of the questions relate to how something that they're doing in terms of getting a vaccine or in terms of nutrition or a whole range of things will impact their children. So there is just more of a focus on women of reproductive age in all research, in all of these studies, because of the connection to children's health. What we need to think about and say, and in other parts of my work, I've worked on intimate partner violence and nutrition. And in that field, most of the research is how does intimate partner violence against a mother impact her child's nutrition? But how does it impact their own nutrition? Like, intimate partner violence, any form of violence against women, is a human rights violation. It's not only a problem because of what happens to their own children. They might not be mothers through choice or not, but in older age, in order to be able to protect women throughout the life course, we also need that data. So the focus is on that age group because of the types of interventions that are, that come out of these data. And it's newer to include older women. So it is happening, but because of the inadequate age disaggregation, even of the data that is there, it's not giving us enough information.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for highlighting that. And in terms of the data that we do have, is there any sort of variations across countries or areas of the world on the rates of violence against older women, or any sort of commentary we can make there?
No, because of the lack of
Right.
disaggregation, we can't, and we only have 10, like I said, only 10% of the data is representing older women. With that, we can't really generalize across countries or regions or areas. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I think it's also helpful just for our audience to go over maybe the different types of violence in greater detail. So could you maybe help provide a bit more of an overview of the types of violence that older women experience?
Sure. So what we know from the reproductive age group, from 15 to 49, is that intimate partner violence is the most prevalent form of violence. So that's any form, physical, sexual, emotional, economic, controlling behaviors perpetrated by a current or former intimate partner. So that is the most common form of violence globally. That is also prevalent for older women, and in the studies that we examined, was reported, like I said, as a continuation often of relationship dynamics from earlier in that relationship. But we also don't know enough in this field to say that that is the most prevalent form. Because of some of the data limitations, we are not asking enough questions about perpetrators. And so again, if you're asking the older women the exact same questions as you're asking the women of reproductive age, then you're mainly focusing on intimate partners and you're asking a little bit about non-partner sexual violence. But any form of violence that's perpetrated by a caretaker, a different family member, occurs in an institution is not captured there. So we can say these are the forms of violence that exist. One of them is intimate partner violence. It is the most prevalent in terms of 15 to 49. We do not know enough to be able to say that for older women. We just don't have studies that include every kind of perpetrator. And we do know that there are more different types of perpetrators, different types of caregiving and caretaking relationships for older women that might put them in a situation where they're a victim of violence from a different perpetrator. So there's non-partner sexual violence, which includes rape, but is any form of unwanted sexual contact, touch, experience. And then there's also economic, physical, sexual, we've said sexual, but economic, physical, and controlling behaviors that can occur from non-intimate partner relationships. They can be other family members. That's sometimes grouped more broadly under the category of domestic violence. So things that happen in the household with other family members as well. And so those are the different forms. Those are equally experienced by older women. But what we did see and what we do see is that there may be a shift from a prevalence or a more common experience of physical or sexual violence in reproductive age to more emotional violence, coercion, economic control. And so that can be a result of a violent partner aging and being sicker and not physically able to enact physical or sexual violence. So there's different power and dynamics that can occur in that relationship that could change the types of violence that older women are experiencing.
Thank you. And could you maybe highlight some examples of what, say, economic coercion or coercive behavior looks like, or also just in terms of limiting one's ability, or if there's, restriction to one's mobility, sort of what examples of those types of violence would look like?
Yeah, so based on these discussions and an expert meeting that we held, the WHO has come up with a module, particular questions that should be asked for women older than 60 years and older, and that those are being piloted in different countries and different services, different surveys. So some of those items are saying, has anyone, so they're including any perpetrator, ever done any of these things? So stopped you from going shopping, stopped you from going to the church or mosque or temple, whatever, as appropriate, stopped you from volunteering or helping others, stopped you from taking care of grandchildren or being a part of the lives of other relatives or friends. So those are the kinds of controlling behaviors, the kind of coercive control that we're looking at with older women. Economic violence is measured currently for women of reproductive age, and usually includes items such as, taking your salary from you, restricting you from working, spending your money on things that you haven't agreed with. So there's also a range of those kind of forms of economic violence. What we don't necessarily have in this or other surveys, and we also do work at the WHO on the intersection with violence against women with disabilities. And so there as well, there would be some items which might be relevant, things like limiting and restricting access to mobility devices, to medications, forms of neglect, forms of, not helping a person with hygiene and activities that they need help with. So those kind of things can be the things that we really need to understand and are very relevant for older women.
Thank you. And do you have any advice on how to spot that violence is occurring, either to yourself or somebody that you know, or a loved one, and sort of what steps you can take once you do recognize that it's occurring?
So more, yeah, I mean, at the WHO, our focus primarily is on the health sector response. And so we have a lot of training materials and have done trainings globally for healthcare providers to do basic interventions for women that they see, that comes into their services. And one of the pieces there that we really focus on and want them to understand is something that we've called lives. So that's an acronym for how should healthcare providers respond if a woman discloses, if they find that a woman that they're treating is experiencing violence. So the first is listen. So just listen closely with empathy, not judging, saying things like, I've you're not the only woman this happens to, and it's not your fault. Then it's inquiring about needs and concerns. So within the sector of the health sector, what are the kind of things that people could do? What can the healthcare provider do for women that are experiencing violence? The next one's also very relevant, validating, so showing that you believe and that you understand her. There's a lot of, after a lot of the Me Too, there's, the phrase believe survivors. And so when or if a woman discloses, to show basic support by validating and showing that you believe her is a really huge one. And enhancing safety and support. So what are the things that this woman can do and needs to do in order to be safe, to have some safety planning? A lot of the time, people are not in the position to leave the abusive situation, but how can they promote and increase their safety just within the context that they're in, or if it's involving children and other family members as well. And so all of that's at the healthcare level. At the level of the individual, some of those are still relevant in terms of listening, empathy, validating, believing survivors. It's very, very important principle is not to go out and search for victims and survivors, to say that women need to be at a point where they want to disclose. You might ask questions. Is everything okay at home? Is there anything you want to tell me in a supportive way? But outright asking about violence in many contexts is not going to be safe, and is not going to be what the woman needs at that time. And also at all points to understand confidentiality. If you're in a role, and if you're in a situation that has mandatory reporting, the woman needs to be very clear and aware of that, and you need to explain very, very clearly what would happen if a disclosure occurs. If it's on an individual level of a friend or a family member, and you're not in a mandatory reporting context, then making it clear that, and following through on principles of confidentiality around anything that's disclosed, and not breaking that trust, because that's really key in building your relationship and the trust of that woman. And although you may perceive her as needing X, Y, and Z services, many, many times women do not want to go to the police, do not want to leave a situation. You may tell them about those options and tell them about alternative housing options, alternative services, but strongly encouraging or taking actions on your own towards that is not the right thing to be doing.
No, thank you for highlighting that. That's a very important point to make, that we really do need to make sure that women are autonomous in their own decisions, and safety is a primary concern on sort of repercussions that would happen if they do come forward. So thank you for raising that. I guess I'm also curious, given sort of the often hidden nature of this issue, how can we raise awareness about violence against older women?
I think that, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think part of it is having the data and the evidence that I've mentioned, and to be able to say more, because if we look back 10 or 15 years, part of what really shifted how we understand violence against women globally, that there are even countries that are using the word epidemic, is the data and the work that was done to generate it and to analyze it, and to be able to come up with numbers and say 1 in 3 women globally have experienced violence in their lifetime. Those kind of numbers we need and are very powerful. So part of what's blocking that, I think, and I haven't also mentioned, is ageism. So there are just beliefs around the role of older women and where they are in their life, and what kind of experiences they could be having, that really block people from even perceiving that violence could happen against older women. And there were stories in some of the studies we were looking at that were saying, that older women would go to a healthcare professional and say, oh, this is what's happening to me. And they would say, oh, that just sounds like normal relationship things, and it's not such a big deal, because, your partner, your husband is a 80-year-old who has cancer, how could he really be hurting you? But that kind of ageism and those like not, but and then the intersection with sexism of not, of not believing women about health complaints and medical conditions. And so I think addressing some of those norms, having the data and being able to bring that out, and then some of what your organization is doing, but having conversations about this, bringing the data out, using it to lobby and to increase awareness of this issue.
Thank you for that. And I'm also just wondering, in terms of, a lot of our work at the IFA does look at sort of the setup of environment or age friendliness of environments. Is there any research or knowledge that you have on sort of the impact of the community that one's living in, whether it be an urban environment or more rural, if there's any impact there on, I guess, connection to resources or the prevalence of violence against women?
There is research on kind of neighborhood level correlates of violence against women. There's nothing that I've seen that's specific to older women that could be kind of generalized. Like we have, anecdotally, a couple of studies, mainly from the US, of sort of rural isolation. And I mean, you could hypothesize that if you're further from services and less educated and less able to understand and navigate systems, then there would be more blocks to service provision and accessing services, and that's seen globally. But in terms of, judging particular environments as age friendly or aging friendly or not, and how that impacts particularly violence, I haven't seen that data, no.
Okay, yeah, no, just curious. Thank you for answering that. In terms of the impacts that violence against women has, what are the sort of short and long-term physical, mental, sexual, and health impacts that women who experience violence face?
Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's across all of those things. So you have injuries, you can be hospitalized for injury. There are studies on traumatic brain injury, usually amongst slightly younger women, but that, that the correlation between, cognitive decline and aspects in later life are correlated with earlier traumatic brain injury due to IPV. So mental, you have anxiety, depression, increased risk of suicidal ideation and suicide. Sexual and reproductive health, you have increases in unwanted pregnancies, in abortion, low birth weight. So like I've said, there are impacts on the child, often lower rates of vaccination, poorer nutrition amongst children of women who've experienced violence. So all of that, there's a really robust evidence base where we can look at systematic reviews and meta-analyses and see the short and long-term impacts. So specific to older women, some of the emotional aspects and the mental health aspects that we saw, one thing that really came out is aspects of regret and loneliness and guilt. And so it's reflecting back on a lifetime of experiencing violence and feeling, why did I put up with this? Women saying, I was so stupid, I was such a fool for doing this my whole life, and now I'm at the end of my life, what am I going to do about it anyway? That older women often talked about different aspects of chronic illness. So bodily pain, reduced mobility, hearing problems, things that people would often just associate with aging, and obviously may be associated with the general aging process, but that women who were going through that process and had also experienced and were experiencing violence linked those things together. So violence is very bad for quality of life, for mental health and for physical health for all women, and particularly when it intersects with aging and the vulnerabilities that can bring, we can see some really quite significant physical and mental health impacts.
Thank you. And I guess I'm interested as well in terms of self conceptualization that violence has occurred. Do you think that, social media or new technologies have changed the way that socially we understand violence against women, or do you think that they can be used as a tool to reduce gender-based violence?
So yes, I have a sort of a yes, but there is
Okay.
a lot of, I would say that the Me Too movement, that stories that have come out, through Twitter or TikTok or Instagram and different things have to some degree, raised awareness, shown, survivors speaking out, can be used certainly for raising awareness. I think for older women, we need to really look at, how much are they interacting with social media or with digital media. It certainly can be a form of social support. So are women using WhatsApp or video calls or messaging and things that they weren't previously doing now that they have access to a phone and internet and such. But there is also the flip side of these as tools to reduce gender-based violence is that there's also increasing awareness about technology facilitated gender-based violence. And so that's forms of abuse, controlling behaviors that are really done online. And we see that quite significantly, when we hear stories of bullying and of younger children and their use of social media. But we do also see across many, many different areas. We have colleagues who are doing a study on technology facilitated threats to female politicians. So when there are many, women in particularly powerful positions, that they are getting death threats, rape threats, extreme violence online. And so that I would caution to see, online communications as necessarily only an intervention to solve things,
Right.
and also to think about ways in which it can also be an additional form of control. So you have also where phones are used for tracking women, for checking your messages, knowing where you are at all times. Those can be linked actually to coercive behaviors and controlling behaviors.
Right. No, thank you for highlighting that and also acknowledging that it's not a net positive to have access and use of social media. There's some really great conversations going on in the chat here that I just want to recognize, and thank you, Pat, for including a resource for the prevention of elder abuse here in the chat there. We have a question from Johanna who is asking, is there any connections being made with the structural violence against women and how this affects women in their life course?
Yeah, so I think generally research on violence against women does take into account that structural level. It could do it more explicitly, but definitely even just looking at the data and how we see prevalence, the dynamics differently across different countries and regions and such, and we can see that clearly structural issues like poverty, women's, discrimination against women, their isolation or their not being full members of society or of economic life, is interacting with violence. So there's certainly recognition of that structural piece. The degree to which it's included, in every study or in all research is varies certainly, but. And it's also structural violence is something that's a little bit harder to always, measure or conceptualize it. It's used quite differently across different studies and data.
No, thank you. That makes sense. And thank you for that. Unfortunately, we're getting pretty close to our end time here. We'll have time for maybe a question or two more, but just a question from me here is, do we have any effective existing legal frameworks in holding perpetrators of elder abuse and, violence against older women accountable?
I mean, I believe that most countries should have, these things are criminal acts, and
Yeah.
so it's more of a question of enforcement.
Hmm.
So where the laws are there in many, I wouldn't say every single context, there are contexts still where, let's say, marital rape is still not a crime. But largely these are forms of violence that are criminalized, but whether there's actual enforcement, and also this goes back to something, we discussed a little earlier, but of women's interests or desires or preferences and choices is if we're talking about their child or their partner, is that someone that they want to see imprisoned? Um, or are there different forms of interventions that they would prioritize? So even if enforcement were perfect, which it's far from, um, is that exactly what women want in that situation? And sometimes certainly the case. And were that enforcement actually effective, it would reduce violence for some women. For others, that's going to be breaking up a family, potentially taking away a breadwinner. They will worry about the impact on their children. So it's something to think about carefully.
Thank you. And just coming to a close now, sort of where do you see the future direction of violence against women going globally in terms of the knowledge that we have now, the lack of evidence, and sort of the desire for change that we still are seeing? Where do you see us heading?
Um, I think it is a very energetic and enthusiastic crowd of researchers and activists and women. And I see that there's a lot of young people coming into the field, and that is very energizing. So I see in many ways I'm very hopeful, and that we are getting better and more data, that we're moving in that direction. On the other hand, the reality of politics globally, and change it, what are going to be inevitably some very large changes in funding availability for this programming, I think could really hinder some of the work going forward. We do know of effective interventions. We're learning more about how and where they can be implemented, but we need to have the resources to do it.
Thank you so much for that. And we are just unfortunately coming to a close here. And I would love to hear your key sort of takeaway message for our audience today. But to give you a moment to gather your thoughts, I will introduce next week's speaker. So please join us next week in our conversation with Mr. Isaac Longobardi on Moving Forward Coalition Promoting Action on Nursing Home Quality Improvement. So very much looking forward to next week's discussion as well. But now back to you, Dr. Meyer. Could you share a takeaway message for our audience here today?
Sure. I would say the takeaway should be that violence against older women occurs, is highly prevalent, and is very impactful on their physical and mental health. But that well-designed interventions, more data and evidence, and programming in place can support women who are experiencing violence.
Thank you so much for that. And just a reminder for everyone to take a look in the chat. There's some really great resources being shared by your audience members, and the IFA again has put some information about our survey in the bottom there. But thank you so much, Dr. Meyer, for being so generous with your time with us today, and very informative on what is occurring for violence against women right now, and really ensuring that older women are not left out of the conversation. So thank you
Thank
very
you
much
so
for your
much.
time.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone else for your dedicated support, and special thanks to Luana, who helps us out every week here at the IFA. But thank you all. Enjoy your weekend and hope to see you all next Friday. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.